Welcome to Conversations of Hope, a podcast that shines light into the darkness of childhood sexual abuse. I am your host, Faith Ingram of Speaking Truth in Love Ministries.
And I am Michelle Viscuse from Journey Pink. We are both survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and we're sharing our healing journey to raise awareness and provide hope and support to other survivors.
We know what it's like to feel all alone with our secrets, but we also know what it's like to find freedom. We are breaking the silence that allows sexual abuse to thrive and using our voices to empower and encourage those who have experienced abuse.
Our goal is to create a safe space for survivors to find hope and healing in community. Thank you for joining us.
Michelle, today we're going to talk about our stories. Next week, we're going to go a little bit into how to tell your story in the ways that our listeners can begin the process, if they haven't already, of telling their stories. I know when I started my healing journey, which was around 2007, I read a book called Invisible Girl, and the author of that book said that the beginning of healing is telling your story. And I have found that true in my healing journey. I was abused by my father, who was a pastor. I was born the sixth of 9 children, and I have 8 brothers, so I was the only girl. And I accepted Christ when I was 5 years old, and I'm glad that I made that decision, and I have never really turned back from that decision. And I think that because of that decision, I was more resilient even when I was going through the abuse than I would have been otherwise. Because even though I felt all alone, I still felt that relationship with Jesus Christ and that he loved me, even though I was going through some very difficult times and I couldn't talk to a lot of people about what I was going through. So we talked a little bit about keeping secrets last time, and I kept the secret of my abuse for a very long time. And a lot of it is, as a pastor's daughter, you are told that you need to, the joy of the Lord is your strength. You need to forgive. You need to let God take care of everything. So you were conditioned not to talk about anything negative that happens to you. Because then I felt like if I talked about negative things, that I was complaining or being, I don't know, just ungrateful, unthankful, that type of thing. So I never complained. If I talked about anything, it was always the good things that were happening to me. And I was very quiet, very shy. I was shut down. And the way that I dealt with the abuse is that I died emotionally. My abuse lasted from about the time I was 9 until I was around 18. And I didn't tell anyone because you don't know what's going to happen within your family. You don't know if your dad's going to go to jail. You don't know if you're going to be put in foster care.
Right.
I knew how to survive where I was, but what was going to happen, what would happen to my family, what would happen to the people I loved, all of those things go through your mind. So you just keep everything to yourself and you suffer in silence. And I didn't start my healing journey until after my dad molested my niece, and I then came out with my story in support of her.
Right.
That was actually the beginning of the healing, because then I could start taking down those walls that I had built up to protect myself from being abused by others and start to process all of the trauma that I had suffered as a child and let God come into those places and heal me And I know that a lot of survivors, their stories are very similar. They kept their secrets.
Right. That's one of the ways we survive is by keeping the secret. So it helps us survive, but then it also kills us on the inside because it, like you said, destroys your emotions. It destroys your body awareness. Like it also makes you suppress a lot and stuff a lot. And
Mhm.
all of that plays out like in your health and things like that. And so while we're keeping the secret to survive, it's to our detriment because that's not how God created us to be. You know, He didn't create us to um, harbor these horrible traumas and hide them and suffer that way. And so I too was sexually abused as a child. My abuser was my father, and I don't have a memory of the start date. So I don't know when it started. I don't remember it not being there, but I do know that it lasted until college. And so I was an adult when it ended, and I was a child when it started. And talk about shame. I mean, that really made me feel a lot of shame because even though I was an adult, that part of me was still like a child. Like I was so manipulated and so brainwashed that I didn't know how to get out. In fact, like the reason it stopped was because I finally lost it one time and I didn't know it was going to stop, but it did. And so I used my voice actually by accident. Like I just I went a little berserk and it never happened again after that. However, I didn't know it wasn't going to happen again after that. It took a while for me to think maybe it's ended, like maybe it's not going to happen anymore. And there wasn't really a discussion about it. It just stopped. And, everything was pretend anyway. So you went about life smiling like it was good, telling
Right.
jokes like it was funny, being in the same room, giving a hug. You, I already knew how to do those things. I knew how to function
Mhm.
in those environments. And so I think that's the part that's really hard because that's what you had to do to survive. Like you did what
Right.
you had to do to survive. And that doesn't mean that, that shame is yours or that it's anything that you did wrong. But it took me a long time to learn that and to undo that in my mind because I didn't tell my husband and we had children. And it was after the birth of my daughter that, I mean, the minute she was born, I was crying when we brought her home. And my husband's like, "Why are you crying?" And I told him that I was crying because I was sad that our only child was going to be upset. But the real reason I was crying was because I was scared to death about protecting her. And I couldn't even put words to that. Like I couldn't even say that to him
Mhm.
because I was afraid he would ask more questions or whatever. But the reality is, I was terrified about how to protect her. And right around the time maybe she was 5, that's when I started having flashbacks and panic attacks. And that's what led me to go see a counselor. But even when I went into the counselor's office, I did not have words to say that I had been abused. I simply said, there's something wrong with me and I feel green. Like I feel terrible about myself. And even though I'm successful and I know a lot of people and have a lot of connections, I don't feel close to anybody. No one knows the real me. I don't know the real me. I feel like people tolerate me. Like I had such a bad sense of worth. And it all stemmed from the abuse and all from the shame of the abuse. And so in that first session, she just let me share that part. It took a session or two for me to even acknowledge
Mhm.
where that shame and that green came from and why I felt that way. And even then, I think maybe had told 2 people. And that was recent. Like they knew I was going to call a counselor. And so they were there to help me, after sessions and to process things that maybe had come up. They were praying for me in those sessions. And eventually, after 3 years of therapy, within those 3 years, pretty soon after, I think within the first year, I had, disclosed it. I confronted my abuser and then disclosed it to my family. And then I started to tell other people. I still didn't think I would ever go public with my story, but I know how hard it was to tell. Like you mentioned a book. I can remember going into bookstores, like used bookstores, and just looking on the shelves for any and every book on sexual abuse. Some of them were not helpful. I will tell you that. Some of them were not helpful. Some were, but some were not helpful. And because I was afraid to order anything online, I didn't want sexual abuse touching my name in any way. Like I didn't want to be associated with it. So I was afraid if I bought the book, even walking up to the register in the used bookstore, I held my head down in shame. I felt so embarrassed. I asked for a bag. I hid it in a bag in my home. I didn't tell my husband. And so the process of telling your story it's incredibly difficult because your voice has been stolen. You don't have a voice. And so it took a while, but little by little, it's like you said, every time you tell your story, there's more healing.
Yeah. And you're sharing it communicate the shame that so many survivors feel. And it isn't their shame. It isn't their sin. They were abused. They were sinned against.
Yeah.
Somebody used their power and control to manipulate them and to take advantage of them. And that's not their fault.
No.
And it will never be their fault. We all have things that we've done that we are responsible for. But when somebody abuses us or sins against us, that's not our sin. But we still feel that shame and that guilt. And we feel like maybe that there was something that we could have done or should have done to make it different or to make it not happen. And as you were sharing your story, you were saying that when it finally ended, you didn't know that it was the end. And that was the same situation with me when I did tell him no at one point, and he listened to me. I finally used my voice as well, but you don't know that he's going to listen to you the next time,
Right.
or the next time after that. So you're always, even though it has stopped, you're always like waiting for when will be the next time that I'm alone with him or he has an opportunity and he takes advantage of me again. So those things do come into play, and people, no matter what their story is, whether they were abused multiple times by one offender, multiple times by many offenders, or one time by one offender, it's always traumatic.
Yeah.
And it's not a comparison of who has the worst abuse. It's abuse. Abuse is abuse. And it's always wrong. And it's never the fault of the victim. It's always the fault of the offender. And it sometimes bothers me when people will say, well, was your offender abused? And that might be, or it might not be, but if you're abused, it does not give you an excuse to abuse others. In fact, it should make you more sensitive and more compassionate to not want to abuse other people and make them go through what you went through. It's not an excuse for an offender to say, okay, I was abused, so therefore I can abuse you or I can abuse other people. Because we still, especially as adults, we can make choices and we can say, I'm not going to do that. You know, our past does not dictate what our future is. You know, I was abused, but I don't have to be an abuser.
That's right.
I can overcome.
Yes. Yes. That part's hard. And like when people say something like, well, why didn't you tell or why didn't you say something? I remember like now I can handle that question better because I understand the complexities of why I didn't tell. But in the beginning, when I was just trying to get the words out of my mouth and share with people, they're like, well, why didn't you say something? Or why didn't you tell? And not being able to fully answer that question then again makes you feel like something's wrong with you. Like, why didn't I tell? Here I am again, like something's happened and I didn't do something about it. So maybe that means, and then your brain, takes the blame
Right.
trail again. But the reality is, when it comes to sexual abuse, there's so much manipulation and brainwashing that takes place even before abuse happens. Like you are so conditioned that there seems like there is no way out. Absolutely no way out. And I had so many fears. I was so afraid of anyone finding out, much less me telling anybody. That wasn't even a possibility because so many bad things would happen if I said something and then it was going to be all my fault. And so again, I survived by keeping the secret. But then
Right.
keeping the secret also hurts us. Not helpful to keep secrets. We weren't designed to keep secrets. And the thing that happens with trauma, like you mentioned, whether it's one time, one person, multiple times, it's still trauma. And we don't have a place in our brains that makes sense of that because that's not how we're designed and that's not how we're designed to be treated. And so when something like that happens, it throws everything off. It throws off physical, mental, emotional, all spirituals, your soul, all of that stuff gets disrupted. Um, so I fully agree that like it's painful. It's hard. It's really
Right.
hard.
And when you put in the added trauma of being abused by somebody that violated a trust that you had in them. Like, we were both abused by our father, who was supposed to love and protect us, and instead used his power and authority over us to abuse us. And that is so hard to process, how somebody that you love and you thought that they loved you enough to protect you is actually the one that's harming you and doing you the most harm in your life at that point. And you're thinking, okay, how can this be? And you can't make sense of it because it doesn't make sense. And then you get God's um image and who God is all confused with who your father is and who you thought your father was. And because he isn't who he should be, then that really confuses you spiritually as well. And we will talk more about this, but um, sexual abuse is a complex situation. It's not one size fits all, quick, easy, forgive, forget, and it's all over. It's not. It's a complex issue. And there's a lot of different things that come in when you're healing from this abuse, when you're processing what you've lost and how that affected all of the other relationships that you've had since then, because it does. It affects
Wow.
so much things in your life.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about a lot of different things because it is a very complex issue
Yes.
and there's not an easy fix.
Right. And like you said, the relationships part. And what is love? What is
Mhm.
love? What does it mean to be loved? What does I love you mean? And
Right.
when in church I would hear that like God is our father, then what does that mean? Right. And
Mhm.
so
Right.
I really empathize too with people who've experienced abuse in church or at church or around church because it totally really distorts. It makes it so hard. Like I have so much compassion for people that still, you know, are trying to be involved in church, but it's such a struggle because it's really hard. And even though my abuse didn't happen in church or around church, I can still see how spiritually it really messed with my mind, especially on who God is, who He says I am, what is love, what does it mean to be loved, especially by God, who is our Father. And so I think that, that's another thing where the church can have a lot of compassion and empathy for survivors who there's a lot of struggle there, a lot of
Right.
struggle. It takes a lot to even wrap your head around that sometimes, and find that healing. That took time. And even though I didn't even realize how warped my thinking maybe was until I realized it because it's all you know,
Right.
right? It's all you know. I didn't get a different outlook and then something happened. Like that was all I knew. And so that makes it complicated. There's a lot to it.
There is. And I think sometimes victims are re victimized in church, not because the people in church are trying to cause more harm or hurt, but just because they aren't aware
Right.
of the things that they are saying that are re victimizing victims. Like, for instance, forgive and forget. Forgiveness is part of the healing process, but it is a process and it doesn't cause instant healing.
Mm-mm.
Because if I were hit by a truck and I were to forgive the driver of the truck, I'm in the hospital with broken bones and maybe permanently disabled because I'm paralyzed. If I forgive the driver of the truck, I am not going to be instantly healed.
Right.
I may have permanent injuries. I may have injuries that will heal over time,
Mhm.
but my healing isn't dependent on how forgiving I am
Right.
or how loving I am to the person that caused me harm. My healing comes, like the physical healing comes through medical intervention, and my emotional healing comes through maybe counseling or working through the trauma. And my spiritual healing comes through working with my relationship with God and letting Him show me who I am in Him and who He is, and not looking at it through the eyes of a victim, but looking at it through the eyes of a child of God. Our thoughts and beliefs are affected by our abuse,
Mhm.
and there's no way to separate them out. Eventually we heal and we grow and we mature and we say, okay, I believe that was true because of what I went through, but it's not really true. This is what really is true. And it's sorting out those truths and lies that,
Yes.
because we believe a lot of lies because of what we have gone through.
Right. And when I went into counseling originally, I was ready to forgive early. I said, I know I need to forgive him. God's told me I need to forgive him. So I'd like to just go ahead and forgive him. And my counselor was wise to say, we're not going there yet. Not yet. We'll get there, but we're not going there yet. And do I believe that God can instantly heal? Absolutely. I do. And I prayed for him to instantly heal me. Like, I don't want to go through this. I don't want to think about this. I don't want to be in counseling this long. Can you heal me as soon as possible? But looking back at that, I am thankful that he took the time to peel back the layers, to tend to each and every
Mhm.
wound, And he continues to do that. I don't consider myself 100% healed. I'm definitely on the other side from where I was before, but he still continues to gently peel back layers and tend to wound. And I had to let him into that area. I had to let him into those places. And it was an off limits place before. I served God. I was in church. I was a good Christian woman is what I wanted to be. And that's how I wanted to display. And that's the mask that I wore. But that part of my life was off limits. I didn't talk about that with God. I didn't pray about that with him. It was off limits. And it was just boxed away. And I continued to function as a wife and a mom and a church lady. But I didn't bring that part of my life with me. I carried it, painfully carried it. And I tried to process it and deal with it. But finally, I laid it at his feet. And little by little, he can tend to that. He can tend to all those wounds. He can, meet you in those areas and give you insight. Like you said, there's so many lies that get tangled in our minds with abuse. And it's how we survived. It's what we had to believe to make it to the next day,
Mhm.
But
Right.
he has to reveal those lies to us and then replace them with truth.
Right. Right. And next week, I think we're going to talk about how other survivors can share their stories and what it's like to share your story and finding safe people to share
Yes.
your story with. Because there is hope, and sharing your story is the beginning of that healing process. It's letting that out and opening up the wound so that it can be healed and putting yourself out there. And so I'm looking so forward to the many things that we're going to discuss on the future um podcasts.
Yes. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. We hope this podcast is a source of comfort and inspiration for those who are struggling with the aftermath of childhood sexual abuse. Thank you for joining us on this journey of hope and healing.
Please be sure to subscribe and check out our show notes for more information. See you next time on Conversations of Hope with Faith and Michelle.